Okay, great. So welcome to our next in our series of peer-to-peer brought to you by NAEA, the National Art Educators Association, from the Museum Education Division. I'm Michelle Grohe. I'm the current Eastern Region representative for the Museum Education Division. And welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is a new era for our peer-to-peer initiative where instead of bringing together panelists or different art museum educators to talk about different types of programs, we're kicking it into a different gear with what we're calling Reading Days series, where we're taking a closer look at books, articles, ideas that are around, and we've been talking a lot about how often it's really hard to find the time or carve out the time, particularly during the workday, to reread material or even sit down and read things, or once we do read them, do we just file them away, or do they have a place in our work, and how do they go about informing what we do? So thank you for joining us. So there are a few of us that are here participating via video, and we will have some probably have some folks that are joining us as viewers, so feel free to chime in. If you're interested in contributing ideas or questions, you can just type them into the Q&A box that's below the Google Hangout here, and we can address it as we go along. All of the peer-to-peer Hangouts are archived on the NAEA Museum Education Division Google Plus page, and so this is being recorded and will be archived and available for later viewing. And as we go along addressing the questions that have been submitted through the Q&A box, those will get bookmarked throughout the video, so you can go and scroll through to see what is there. So that's my introduction, and we look forward to sharing our ideas together, both here through video and then also with viewers that are at home or at work watching us. So, so I thought we'd just introduce who's here by video. Why don't I go to you next, Mike, if you just want to introduce yourself.
Sure, yeah. Mike Morawski, Director of Education and Public Programs at the Portland Art Museum in Oregon.
And see, who would like to go next?
I'll jump in. On the other side of the U.S., I am Madeline Adams, and I am Assistant Curator of Education for Family Programs at the Birmingham Museum of Art.
Okay.
And on the other side of the world, is my mic on? Yep. It's Christine Healy. I'm the Education Manager at Hardy Museum of Modern Art in Melbourne, Australia.
Great. And it's great. This is the great thing about peer-to-peer is we can connect with colleagues from around the world. And thank you, Christine, because it's a full 15 hours later for you, so or in the future, I should say, from those of us here in the U.S. So thank you so much for getting up early to join us. And so today for the reading day, we are focusing on the works of Maxine Greene. So particularly this book, The Variations on a Blue Guitar, which is a collection of her writings and lectures. Maxine Greene is often cited by a lot of art museum educators, in particular for someone who really informs their work or drives their work. And so she recently passed away, so we thought that we would revisit some of the things that she's written about, take a closer look, and just reflect together about some of the things that were standing out about ideas that she shared before. And Madeline, do you want to talk for a little bit, because you were saying you have a colleague at your museum that still has some connection with the Lincoln Center Institute?
Absolutely. One of my colleagues, Susie Harris, from School and Teacher Programs, and she goes, I believe she's one of their Scholars Fellows, but goes to the Lincoln Center maybe twice a year for their conferences for educators and brings those ideas back to the Birmingham area and really creates our teacher workshops, and has, I think, 2 days a year, there's these massive Lincoln Center inspired workshops inviting in different Lincoln Center educators. And so really kind of bringing in a lot of the philosophies and ideas and teaching styles, and bringing in a lot of ideas from these workshops to how do you use art in all different kinds of curriculum. And my experience kind of as a bystander with this and hearing her reports, is that it's extremely informative, and the teachers who have had the opportunity to come to these free workshops that we were able to provide walk away with the, wow, I never knew the museum was that helpful. I never knew art and education were that closely linked. So it has been a very great way of passing on, again, the bit that I did read about the Maxine Greene and the initiatives were really passing on those ideas of this is what, not just teaching the students, but empowering the teachers to bring that into the classroom, because that's how you reach the most amount of the public. Yeah.
Great. Oh, sorry, did I cut someone off?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Good. And I mean, a lot of the, at least the beginning portion of the book, are talking about some of the essays and writings that Greene wrote in terms of aesthetic education versus or compared to art education. And so thinking about how we define, so I found myself kind of not questioning, but kind of going back and revisiting, like thinking about art education and aesthetics. What is the role of aesthetics within what we do in terms of art museum education? How we define it? Should it be measured? So a lot of different questions that are kind of swirling around there. And one of the things that really stood out to me is that aesthetic education is something that I would say is very important to a lot of the work that we do with school and teachers here at the Gardner Museum. But it's something that I would say isn't, trying to think of the right way to phrase it. It seems more like an internal goal, like it's something that we really value. And we're using, when we talk to schools and teachers, it's something that we're focusing on, like developing students' curiosity, helping them to connect with different works of art, helping them to think about different types of art forms. But it might not necessarily be the way that I market the program or talk about as the one takeaway for the students. The teachers that we work with are not art teachers, they're more general classroom teachers. And so aesthetics necessarily isn't high up on their list. So even though they're getting that aesthetic education, it's not the driving force for how I pitch the programs or how we talk about what's being learned. And I was thinking about that a lot because we spend a fair amount of time studying both aesthetic development as well as other things like critical thinking or comfort in the museum. But the aesthetic development piece tends to be something more that helps myself and our staff in terms of program development and curriculum and things of that nature. So I started to think about that a little bit because there was a quote, I think it was on page 7 or 8, where it was talking about how in order to create aesthetic experiences for our students, we first have to be capable of reflecting on our own aesthetic education and our own aesthetic experiences. So it made me think a little bit about how I approach my own experiences, but also how I'm going about communicating that with the different audiences we work with. And I don't know if that sparks any ideas or comments from anyone else.
I mean, Michelle, that's I'm glad you mentioned that quote, because that's, you know, so Maxine Greene's work kind of has trickled not trickles by not flow. I mean, it's been stronger than a trickle, has flowed its way into a lot of museum education and museum teaching practice these days without her writing necessarily being that primary text that I think we're reading, and we talked about that a little bit before we came on air here. But that's one of those ideas. I think it flowed its way through Rika Burnham, who's one of the main people who really has been working with Maxine Greene in terms of museum education and bringing that, I think, to the forefront of our practice. That whole idea that in order to facilitate experiences, aesthetic experiences, one needs to have them, and I think that's where the Teaching Institute museum education experiences, or even the gallery teaching marathon that we did recently, is continuously trying to focus on experiences with art, without always there needing to be a very pragmatic or direct, developing a program or coming up with some new model or developing, there doesn't always have to be a measurable outcome to it, which is one of those things that I think I've always really loved about museum education, art museum education specifically, is that sort of improvisational extended experience that you can have with art, and it kind of shifts and changes you a little bit and you learn something about yourself. But it's also the absolute hardest thing to pin down and communicate to teachers or museum visitors. And Michelle, you mentioned that you don't always describe your programs to teachers in these words. But when you leave a really good one, usually some element of this aesthetic experience or aesthetic understanding that's bigger than just information and facts or museum comfortability has happened. And it's hard to communicate about that, but still really important, I think. So that's one of the things that I think has driven a lot of my practice for a long time, that has come from Maxine Greene. But again, she's not necessarily, always that primary source that I've been going back to, admittedly.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too, the whole idea of aesthetics, and just trying to pin down what we think aesthetics might actually even be. And I really like this it's an Elliot Eisner quote where he talks about aesthetics as being the opposite to anesthetic, and where anesthetic closes down all your senses and essentially puts you to sleep. Aesthetics, or the experience, and aesthetic experience is about being open with all of your senses, so being able to smell and listen and see and feel and all of those different things. At the students that come to the galleries in Australia, they're usually art students, and aesthetics is quite important in the curriculum, and it's mentioned quite a lot as being something that students need to develop an understanding about. And I think it's really interesting, that difference between our countries with the types of students that are coming to the museums, and your experience, what you were saying before, Michelle, about working with history and humanities teachers, and it's completely opposite here. So it is really interesting.
I want to jump in on that because Christine, you're at a modern art museum, is that correct?
That's right.
And so I feel like my experience in a museum that has a little bit of everything, it's really hard to sell that modern art focus, and that contemporary art and modern art really lends to the idea of the aesthetic, whereas students that come into a museum that have a little bit of everything, currently, the Birmingham Museum of Art, we have pre-Columbian to Native American to Asian to Wedgwood to contemporary art, and it's a lot harder to sell that idea, I think, of the aesthetic, leaning on what Michelle is talking about, as opposed to the let's use the visual arts to help you with your current curriculum, and they walk away with a much broader, it's a way just to get them in the door at least, and then we're throwing kind of the idea of the visual and the aesthetics at them that they don't really realize that's really what they came in for. And so it's almost that, exactly what you say, that your students that are coming to the Modern Art Museum, in a way, already have that expectation open, that that's almost what they're expecting. Is that correct, or?
Yep, that's right. But to say that you're more likely to have aesthetic experiences with contemporary objects or modern art, I don't think that that's true. I think that it could be true of any object, because it has a beauty, it has a form, a shape that we can appreciate or like for one, because it moves us in a particular way. I think that with contemporary art and modern art, there's more likely to be the wow factor, where people will come in and be blown away because they didn't know that art was like that or could do that, or that that's what it could feel like. But which also sort of adds to my belief that I don't think we can have strong aesthetic experiences from pictures of artworks on the internet or in books. I think we need to, it's part of an experience, aesthetics, and actually being with the artworks to see what it does feel like, the scale, the sense of colour, the light, and all the things that can't be photographed are really valuable in that.
And absolutely, and sometimes the smell of it as well, a fresh oil painting or different material, mixed media objects, I mean, that visceral experience is such a key part of it.
And I think that really traditional artworks are very easy for people to understand the aesthetics of it, because there's a very traditional beauty that people really, really like and appreciate and can understand, because a lot of skills being demonstrated. It's with contemporary art, there's anti-aesthetics where, things are made to be ugly or not to appeal, and, people need to find another way to understand them, even though it's not one that they're perhaps, something that they may be liking. And it's interesting that, you know, subject matter can disrupt aesthetics as well, and that we can see something and it's really beautiful and lovely and very appealing, but then when we look at what is the work about, it disrupts. You know, it could be repelling, or it could be, you know, something that is quite disturbing. So it plays with those sorts of, you know, contemporary artwork will play with those things. Yeah.
It was interesting. I was just remembering when you were saying, Christine, that oftentimes with historical art, it might be easier to enter into the aesthetic experience of it, because, I mean, Christine was at the Gardner last fall, and I remember we were walking around together, and the Gardner is not structured or arranged like typical art museums, and our department was just talking about this today. What is, depending on your comfort level with art to begin with, when you walk in, some people really like it's very idiosyncratic. It's arranged the way Mrs. Gardner thought things should look, and it's not arranged by, it's things, furniture is mixed in with paintings and sculptures and pieces of fabric, and it's very discombobulating, and for some visitors they're really excited by that and they think it's really interesting, and then others it's just completely distracting, or they don't want to see it for very long and kind of walk away. But so it's a very, in a way, aesthetically designed experience already because of the way that Mrs. Gardner designed it. So it's been really interesting, you know, thinking about engaging with single works of art, but then also, and that's something that I became more and more aware of as I became more comfortable or familiar with the Gardner. You can't just walk in and look at one piece of work, because there's so many things all around you that you need to take in. And so it's been interesting to think about the aesthetic experience of what it's like to walk into this other type of environment, and what that creates for viewers and visitors as well. And since it's not changing, or it's designed in a way where it can't really change permanently, what can you do to encourage visitors to come back to see more? Even though everything is still in the same place, there's much more that you can see. But just that idea of, I think anytime you go into an art museum or a place that has art, what is, you are affected by the aesthetics of that space as well, and what role does that have with it, and what do you do with visitors that might be less open-minded to that? Because that was another thing that Maxine Greene was writing about in some of the pieces, is part of having this aesthetic experiences is being open-minded or open to ideas and assimilating that and bringing that into part of what you already know. But then how does that then change, or how do you accommodate your approach to it and your knowledge, based on your knowledge and this new information you're grappling with, and how does that deepen your meaning making?
Actually, Michelle, can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
How have you found that experience compared to the new wing at the Gardner, where you do have contemporary works of art that maybe are a bit more challenging? Are you noticing that people sort of feel more comfortable in one space, or it's easier to appreciate one space over the other?
That's a really good question. I
know you've only had a few exhibitions there, and
right,
that it might be difficult to tell just yet, but that would be my guess.
Right. No, I think I think there definitely is a different comfort level, but then I think the comfort level often is dependent on how much preparation or what expectations the visitor has for the museum. So right now we have a Mexican fashion designer's work on view, which is very different in many ways, like different bright colors, but very stark and kind of pared down so that the fashion really stands out. And there's a lot of videos that show the different regions of Mexico and how the different pieces from the fashions are created. So we have this element of this is the fashion, but here's how it's created, and then here's the final product. And that's been interesting because a lot of students have commented, high school students have said, this has broadened my definition of what art can be, which is great. And one student had this fantastic connection to, she loves looking at fashion magazines, and she like pointed at her own clothes like, as you can see, I'm very fashionable and I think very carefully about how I dress. And I was like, great. But she was saying, this makes me realize that what fashion designers do is very artistic and very similar to what artists do, and what types of messages they're trying to convey about personality or identity. And another student chimed in and said, oh, that's kind of like the historic building and what Mrs. Gardner was going for as well. So it's interesting where some connections where you might start with more comfort in one area and it helps you connect with the other. But if you don't know that we have contemporary art here, I think it could be a little jarring, and visitors don't understand why it's here. So it's been kind of all over the place. So that's something we're starting to think about. How can we make these two very different spaces? How can we engage visitors in each of those spaces? That's a good question.
Well, do people think that? Do you feel that museums effectively bring about aesthetic experiences? I was looking at my notes from Greene, and again, my notes from Greene are just Maxine Greene in general, not necessarily from this, but I know that she describes, this idea of imaginative awareness or aesthetic experience with words like focusing, careful noticing, inner time, taking time, moments of stillness, coming to know, and experiencing the arts from the inside, kind of how they mean. And these things take time. They require certain types of, or they seem to me to require certain types of spaces. And people, that visit museums aren't. We haven't trained them for the last couple hundred years to like go in and spend time and really have moments of stillness. And Christine, you mentioned discomfort. I think is one of the key things for me, at least, of having more human, self-reflective experiences with works of modern art, especially when they're not a beautiful painting, is to sort of deal with that discomfort levels. But I'm curious about whether people think that museums are thinking about bringing about aesthetic experience. Do they effectively do that? It sounds like, well, Michelle, your sort of comparison of the two spaces, one seems a little bit more effective in that than the other. I'm just curious what people think about.
It's funny because I definitely think that museums can, but it might not necessarily be at the imaginative, like being imaginative or that awareness, because when I was reading some of that where Maxine Greene's describing kind of the different ways that we can enter or experience works of art, it reminded me a lot of Abigail Hassan's theory of aesthetic development. And when you think about Abigail's stages have 5, with 5 being the most experienced, and the word imaginative is used to describe, is very associated with stage 4, which is actually like a high level of experience. So, but there's a lot of imagination, wonder, and kind of entering into the works that happen at the more beginner level as well. So it's kind of like this combination of openness, being able to look at different things without quite entering into judgment, and then as you progress with your understanding, you start to reinterpret or start to imagine about the artworks at a later point. But it was making me wonder, what can we do to provide those like safe spaces, like you were saying, like that environment, and what can we do to help visitors understand that that's a great thing to do, and you don't always necessarily need one of a museum staff person to facilitate it, or do you?
I think I can speak to that in a sense that the slow art movement itself, that this idea of providing a program and the opportunity for those, whether it is intended by the audience to come in and for the regularly scheduled program, or if they just happen upon it, as well as, I think that's where, that age-old question, museum education, of how much text is too much text on the wall label. Do you want to give more information or not? And, if you have kind of those guided questions or information for people who want to take that time, like what kind of museum goer are you? Are you in a space to be restored, or are you in a space to learn, or to really sit and contemplate, or to take a breath of air in a space full of color? And so I think that I know that we have been talking about that as well, and do provide the slow art experience. So Mike, you brought up an interesting question that a lot of, especially in today's age and kids, this technology and everything is so quick, and how do you teach someone to put technology away and look at something on the wall and take that time to really appreciate, and tapping into the idea of the entire visceral experience of inside that space. So I think that's kind of an interesting, everybody's comes into the museum for a different reason, especially I'm looking over at Julien's question, that meshing with the experience of visiting the museum with other people, everybody finding their own way, and sometimes it's that conversation, sometimes it's that interaction with the other person, sometimes it's that, okay, we'll meet back here in 20 minutes. So I don't know. I mean, I kind of think that it's because I know in my personal life, everything moves so quickly that you're always looking for that moment of still. And I think museums are kind of that great place to be, like, for that moment.
Well, I think, and to, Julian's question, I don't think that people that are watching this can see the question, so I'll sort of read it if that's okay, Michelle. She asks, Julian Chevalier asks if, as experienced viewers of art, can we really, oh, I'm sorry. All those you slipped the questions on me. She asks, Mike, all those modes of looking that I talked about sound so individual and introspective. How does that mesh with the experience of visiting a museum with other people, which is the way most people visit the museum? And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think in my own, when I was thinking about Maxine Greene, just in preparation for this today a little bit, and how she has influenced things I've actually done in the gallery, so school programs or teacher programs, or, and that was primarily before I came here to Portland, what I was working with as docents, teachers, and school, school students, school programs. We had a series of teacher programs that we were leading where we would have teachers spend 2 hours with one work of art as a group with multiple educators facilitating kind of a 2-hour experience with a work of art. And those were the closest thing that I've ever come to with a group that is connected to these ideas of aesthetic experience and this really sort of deeper sort of understanding of art that connects really to our lives and our, I don't use the word soul lightly, but I think in some cases there was a 2-hour experience we had with the series of Gerhard Richter, those paintings where he takes a squeegee and kind of smears paint, abstraction across the surface of the paint. And we were with them for 2 hours doing a lot of creating and making on our own and visual responses using materials, which I think also, from what I understand, connects with, Greene's model of sort of, aesthetic understanding and being able to make something as well. And those were all group experiences, and I think if you'd spend 2 hours with a work of art individually, it's going to be very different. So I think that a lot of those things can be really achieved through group think, and in fact, some cases, one of the reasons I think that Gerhard Richter always rings a bell with me is one of the teachers, after about an hour and a half of being with the painting, we were doing a lot of movement activities and bodily learning with it, and the teacher said that she felt like these like layers of paint. She felt like she was reaching into the layers of the paint, and her mother was on the other side. Her mother had passed away a couple of years prior to that, and her mother was reaching out from the side of the painting, and they couldn't quite ever touch or connect. And everybody's like bawling and crying and like hugging each other and having this, experience that got a lot deeper than something you could measure, and something that I think was a lot deeper. We were having, I use that, Maxine Greene has that word inner time, which I think is really interesting, and I may be misreading that, but I think it was interesting to have this big group kind of really deep experience and extended experience of the work of art. And then those teachers were asked to replicate that with their students. Pick another work of art, have your students come in, you facilitate spending 2 hours. So it was the idea that now you've had an experience, now we want you to come up with a way to envision what that experience might look like for your students, and you lead it and kind of echo that down. And it was really interesting to sort of see Greene reflected throughout those types of experiences. So anyway, I might be going off topic now. But I think that idea of social experiences, group experiences, and conversation is really directly connected to a lot of these introspective ideas, not just individual.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. And I think it's really interesting when people have really powerful experiences with works of art. And we had a Louise Bourgeois exhibition a couple of years ago at Heidi, and people were really emotional in that exhibition, in that space, just walking around on their own. And a lot of people were crying, and it was really something to see. And if we were to measure, and I know it changed some people's lives because, they quit their jobs, or, they reevaluated things that were happening for them, and they saw the world in a different way, or it gave them the capacity to be able to see the world in a different way. And I wonder if that's really where, the power of art lies, in that aesthetic experience. How can we measure that? Is there some way that we can, I don't know, the teardrop meter. Is there some way that we can, because advocacy is such an important part of our role, that we can harness that to be able to, advocate for the arts and the power of the arts to have meaning in people's lives? Or or should we just, you know, let it sit there, you know, nice and quietly, and some people will have those experiences and other people will just feel good? What do you think?
I mean, it's definitely, we use, I mean, Abigail Hassan is the big theory that informs our work, so we do spend some time looking and analyzing aesthetic development using her stage theory. But like I said at the beginning, it's something that we use more internally or amongst colleagues and less with the teachers, just in terms of K through 12 teachers, because it's just not their question. So, but part of what we've been starting to notice in terms of trends of critical thinking are dependent on where the students are in their aesthetic development. So one of the questions that we're starting to revisit is how can we go about sharing that and offering examples of student and teacher voices, actually, because we conduct the same study, we use the same tools with teachers of visitors of all ages. So how can we use all of that data and present it in a way that might pique a little bit of their interest? Because like you said, the aesthetic experience might not be understandable by a lot of people, but how can we start to scratch the surface a little bit more with different audiences and helping them understand that component? Because like you said, there's amazing things that happen in art museums, but how can we do a better job of advocating for it? Madeline shrugs her shoulders. I love that. That's good.
How do you know, is that, how do you measure success? Is it the quantity of people that walk through the door, or is it that one person that had an absolutely incredible experience that there is no way to replicate or recreate, or, you know, except for that warm and fuzzy, I reached one person? You know, it's that as an educator, when you have a classroom of kids in front of you and you have that one light bulb that you see over the kid's head and you realize, okay, I did my job and I did it amazingly. As well as that, Mike and Christine, what you were talking about, you know, Mike specifically to that 2-hour workshop, that everybody becomes engaged and everybody becomes part of it, you know, therefore it's a class of 20 or 30 as opposed to just that one kid. So, I mean, how, it's almost one of those, in my personal opinion, I don't know if you need to measure it. How do you measure it? How can you measure it? You know, some museums have been really creative with the metrics of what was your favorite today, or what did you do today, or what have you. And, you know, that's the reasons that we need to have those measurement systems is to receive the funding and the support from the community to prove that art is that tool that you need. And, you know, how do you prove it? You know, it's that almost everybody that walks into an art museum that I notice walks away with either a smile on their face or a questioning look, or just a better understanding of really what other museum space is, or a better understanding about themselves, or they came in just to the cafe because they wanted lunch and they work across the street, you know. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of the measurement, I think that's, I do really appreciate that Rob Stein essay recently, that Museums So What, which kind of challenges that idea that we, you know, and Dallas Museum of Art too has a lot of data that doesn't necessarily get at what we're talking about. So I think he's at least, you know, conscious of that, but talks about the boy Ben who comes to the Dallas Museum of Art, who is, you know, has a, you know, debilitating sight condition, and you know, wants to see his sort of bucket, you know, his sight bucket list is seeing this Van Gogh painting, and, you know, that's an experience that, you know, happens, you know, like you said, it happens at these types of things happen at museums all the time, but we sometimes I have a fear that when we get into evaluation and measurement, that we're either trying to look for things that are easy to measure, or we're changing what we're doing so that it becomes easier to measure, versus actually completely rethinking the way that we measure what we do. I remember Ben Garcia wrote a piece a long time ago, like a couple of years ago, in Journal Museum Education, that I really liked, about, you know, it was kind of about like what we do best in museums, and it talked a little bit about public value and some of these, you know, debates around museums and public value. So I think there is, you know, I have no answers to it, nor did Rob Stein when he wrote that piece. But wondering, I'm wondering how much some of the ideas of Maxine Greene can actually infuse what we're measuring, the experiences that we're measuring in museums these days, as, you know, NAEA and a couple other, you know, organizations kind of go forward with initiatives to research, you know, what we're doing and what's coming out of these experiences.
Right, because there's different kinds of, I mean, we can collect tons of data and we can use them for different purposes, and whether it's, I mean, because I think the aesthetic, we're all agreeing, like the aesthetic experience can be really powerful, but then who do we, if we do want to measure that or capture it or tell that story in some way, how do we do that, and best practices, and then how do we then use that data effectively? And I think going back to Christine's point of how can we advocate for art museums and what we do and their value in for the public or in society, and like you were saying, like I know NAEA is thinking about that in terms of K through 12 students and the one-time museum field trip and to art museums and what that'll look like. So that'll be interesting to see if we can start peeling back the layers with that audience. Definitely. Let's see, I think there was another question that Julene posted over here that I'll just go to just so we can think about this too. It's, as experienced viewers of art, can we really come to an artwork with the novice eyes of some of our visitors or students? Does that matter? And what if we shifted art experience to another art form or a science field? And I wasn't sure if we had any thoughts on that, those questions.
Need to unmute. The question that I have with that actually is the idea of if we shifted our experience to another art form or science field, as in if we became an expert in those other fields, or if we became the novice in a field that we have no idea, you know, and that kind of brings up two different points, I think, because if we become the novice, the first thing that comes to mind is that idea of fear. You know, how do you approach something? It's kind of, especially as adults, that idea of the unknown, that there is that fear. And so as experienced viewers, I personally cannot come to a work of art or something visual unexperienced. I can't quite erase what I've learned. I can try to put myself in that novice's shoes as best as possible, but I know that if I was to walk into a rocket science lab, I would be completely dumbfounded and totally afraid of anything, in a way, of what goes on. And so it's kind of that, how do you approach those first questions or conversations, and that sort of thing. And Julene just clarified, if we were the novice. So speaking to that, you know, it's like that line or saying, your meaning of those questions. So to me, the first word that really came to mind was the idea of fear.
Yeah, it's interesting to, yeah, I was taking notes and I just wrote novice equals fear and then like a question mark, and then it's like, I mean, I think that's going back to when you were talking about like contemporary art and modern art and historic art, and like where's the comfort level with that too. And I'm just thinking of how many friends or family members I have that refuse to go to art museums because of the fear factor. So it was interesting. As you said that, I had all these mental pictures coming to mind. And then how can we, again, going back to Maxine Greene, how can we help different visitors become comfortable or open to thinking about things in new ways, or just looking at new art and things like that too. So that was interesting that you said that.
Yeah, well, what are people afraid of? I think that they're afraid of looking foolish for an opinion, or thinking a particular thing, or not being able to value works of art that are regarded as being important. So I think it's about losing face and being uncomfortable in those spaces that people are really frightened of. And then there's also the anxiety about actually being in the space, and the do not touch rules, and, you know, don't stand here and don't go there, and you have to, well, yes, you can touch this, and you know, the rules that people are very anxious about in being in a space, and having people watching them watch to make sure that they're not doing that, you know, can be quite anxiety inducing. And so how welcoming our spaces for people that are maybe unfamiliar with artworks to get in them and feel comfortable. And I mean, that's, I suppose, through conversations and or going to talks about artists, a sort of safe places. Although I think it's really interesting because I don't see very many adult tours that are discussion-based, and I think that adults are used to just listening and being told what to think about an artwork and not actually have to have a response themselves. And so I think there's a great loss there for adults, but that's something that we do with students and children really well. And I think it will be really interesting to see if the expectation of that future generation is that they will expect to have more discussions within art galleries. That, you know, are we changing audiences with the way that we're initiating students through galleries? I don't know, but they're things that I think about.
I think speaking to that, some of my best experience with our school groups when I worked at another museum as a school group educator, one of the best experiences was having the parents who were forced to come along as chaperones, or they wanted to take the day off work or spend the time with their kids. And they were the audience for the most part that came up afterwards and said, wow, I never expected this. Okay, when can I come back? How do I get back into the museum again? So it became really rewarding for those adults in that the question-based conversations, the conversation-based experiences in the museum, as opposed to the more of the lecture-typed experience. And so, I mean, how do we get, in a way, the public to speak back? It's kind of that question. How do we, you know, how do you engage the audience so that they feel they are welcome to be part of that conversation? And again, it goes back to everybody's a different type of learner, everybody's a different type of museum experience goer. So how do you reach everyone, or do you need to reach everybody, I guess, is the other big question.
Yeah, I mean, museums definitely, you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, visitor expectations and how museums set up those expectations. They're definitely still, museums still set up visitor expectations to be very information focused and passive and sort of didactic when teaching is involved. And what you said made me think about, I did give a gallery talk at the St. Louis Art Museum when I got hired there, and their gallery talks are fairly, you know, it's art historians coming in or curators. They're really good, but they're, you know, they're informational. It's, for the most part, they're, you know, someone who knows sharing information with people who don't know as much. And I remember we went to a Joan Mitchell painting, spent an hour with it, and most of the time we were writing poetry, drawing, getting into groups, talking about what we were seeing. And at the end of it, I asked people to write down what they thought, like just their feedback on a piece, because they had pads of paper. So I thought, oh, this would be a great moment for me to just write down, free-form writing, what you thought of this experience this evening. And it was like a nighttime gallery talk. And I collected them all. And I would say almost on every pad of paper, somewhere on the note was, I didn't even know this was possible in an art museum. So they didn't even know that you could do that with a work of art. They were perfectly happy with, you know, listening to me talk about the painting and the artist's information and pointing out some things for them. But they seemed so much more satisfied by having, you know, an experience that was more multimodal, that got them thinking and inspired and wondering, and, you know, all these words that we keep bringing back to the surface. And so, yeah, I keep coming back to that idea of, like, how do museums change those expectations? And, you know, is it bit by bit, or is that really the, you know, sometimes I joke about it as the long con, and, you know, trying to slowly convince visitors sort of one by one that this is a little bit, that museums are here for something else other than just informational learning. Yeah, I don't know. I never get as lofty as everyone. But
Sorry, I was muted. Do you ever use that example you just shared in when you, I'm thinking going back to the advocacy piece and describing what we do and the transformative type of experiences like that, do you ever find yourself using that, like a story like what you just said, to talk about how art museums can be transformative spaces?
yeah, I guess not necessarily, because I think that's the, yeah, that's a good question. I think that museums still, there's still a little bit of a dichotomy between, you know, different departments and museums, because I don't think that, I think that gallery experience was fine and dandy, and everyone thought it was good, but it's not like going to change the gallery talks. Was it something, Nylan, that you said, or that to get it'd be really interesting to get visitors to actually like come after an experience like that and tell someone at the museum that matters, hey, this was really great, and I would love to have this type of experience again, or I'd love to bring people back to this type of experience. And I think unfortunately too often, even for us as professionals, these types of experiences still tend to be fairly isolated and heavily facilitated versus, how do museums facilitate. There are moments, I know there are museums, and I've been to some that are successfully trying to really provide the tools to bring about these types of experiences in the galleries as more pop-up things, providing kind of the conditions for, make a gallery conducive for someone spending a lot more time doing drawing, having conversations, and things like that. But I think by and large, those still tend to usually be isolated experiences, or kind of one-off things or something like that, versus trying to actually change the way we're thinking about things. I'm not sure. That's a good question. I haven't really used it as a way outside of our own field to advocate for things like that. We have our own conversations, but how much of these conversations get out to that broader public audience? And how often does a museum have its museum education staff lecture to the public on a Sunday afternoon or Wednesday night or something like that? I know at most of the institutions I've worked at, it's really rare. It's even really rare that a museum would ask an education staff person to give, sort of the official gallery talk. That's an awful lot of authority, quote unquote authority, being handed over to an educator, where education isn't traditionally where museums give authority, even though we interact with more people in most cases than other areas of the museum. But yeah, it's funny how traditional museums can be sometimes in those senses. So.
Yeah. But Mike, that does inform your own practice, doesn't it? That type of feedback.
Yeah, that experience definitely, and I use that story sometimes when I'm thinking about when I'm talking to, I think at the National Docent Symposium I gave a talk, but it's preaching to the choir for the most part. I think I use that as a way to advocate a lot less purely didactic tours and information-based tours, and trying to think about the experiences that we can have in museums, and that if you sit down, the common, when I'm working with docents from my own institutions or museums across the country, the number one question when we finish with an experience is, so what? Like, that was fun, that was great, that was very magical, but who cares? If I do that for a school tour, I won't be a docent for very long because the teacher will be upset. The parents will be upset because we didn't cover enough. It wasn't related to the curriculum, and so I think this whole idea of again, back to Maxine Greene, of facilitating experiences so that we can, or having experiences so we can facilitate those with others, which is what I tell docents or other educators, is that you have to have an experience, a learning experience, a powerful one, and then you can poke at it and talk about it, and we can really deal with what it is to learn in front of a work of art, what it is to make more than learning, I think, just making meaning, creating a sense of digging inside of that work and really pulling out meaning in surprising and unexpected ways. You need to be able to experience that to value that. And so I think that's where I pull out those experiences, maybe to advocate for this stuff, but it's still very internal. It's not especially not any longer with a group of 60 novice visitors, to kind of get back to Julien's point, and then having them be like, wow, that was really cool, and now let's do it with 300 visitors and talk about that. It still ends up being fairly insular and isolated.
Great. So we're coming up to the end of our hour together. So I just wanted to point out the two other comments that we've gotten so far, which is Julien was saying again, I think it's really important for us to force ourselves to be the novices, to remind ourselves how hard, scary, confusing it can be to try and understand something new. And then Jen DePrizio was saying, great point, Christine, about many adult gallery experiences not including discussion. I agree we need to offer more opportunities for adults to participate and gain comfort sharing their thoughts and questions about works of art. Just kind of a few quick responses to some of the things that we've been talking about. So I was wondering if we had any other last thoughts in the last, let's see, we have 4 more minutes left before we wrap up, but any other ideas that have been percolating?
If we can go back to thinking about, sorry, Mark.
No, go ahead, Christine. Go.
If we can go back to thinking about what is it like to be in a different setting or a different place as novice viewers, I often think about the experience of visiting the zoo. So if I go to the zoo and I try to see every single animal in the same day, I'm just going to end the day feeling really worn out, and I've only seen a little bit of everything and haven't had a really rich experience. But I know if I go and sit for an hour with the elephants or with the seals, and then just see a few other animals that are in the area, I'm going to have a richer time. And I think that art galleries are a little bit like that, and that when people come to them, they want to rush around and glance at everything, but not really experience anything. And having discussions with other people in art galleries, so discussion-led tours or things that slow us down, I think can only help people to realise that that's the way that you really need to look at art. And also understanding that people don't have to like everything. We don't have a positive response to all the artworks. And sometimes the works that we actually feel that we don't like or challenge us are often the ones that are more interesting to sort of sit with and try to understand what's going on in that artwork to change our own perceptions.
Another last thought is this conversation really focusing around aesthetics, as I still keep going back to just my own little curiosities about language itself. Is what really is the definition of aesthetics? Is it the strict definition of the word, or is it really that experiential, philosophical conversation about beauty and art and nature? And that's really what this past hour has really been, has kind of that furthering that conversation that this question is never ever going to be answered. And luckily we all work in places where we can attempt to answer it and engage our audiences to be a part of it. And it's interesting when Mike, I forget who was talking, but that idea of engaging the audience, all I can think about is we have a family gallery that engages kids, and it fosters this idea that the art museum is a fun place to be, to interact with an interactive space. Places are hands-on. You can do things that you might not necessarily think about being able to do in an art museum or a gallery space. And I think the best thing is when the adult becomes the observer and they notice that, kind of getting rid of that, going back to this idea of the fear of the novice, when they notice that the kids have already tested the waters and experimented and interacted, it becomes that, in a way, that learning zone that adults that are observing a student's tour or a school group tour, they become more engaged as well as that passive participant, but also that brings up conversations. I've noticed the adults walk away having conversations with themselves or the questioning look on their face. So it's almost that inadvertent way of teaching and passing on this idea of conversation is good, and I don't know, just get more people in the museum.
Yeah. Having unfortunately it's, perhaps sparked by, Maxine Greene's death, but I think having these conversations is important. I know I really do want to go back and read a lot of her original texts and the book that you brought to our attention, Michelle, and thank you for organizing this and bringing this to our attention. I think hopefully we'll go and even if we're just, looking at a slice of her writing and ideas, but I do want to really go back and kind of dig deeper into it and look at this stuff. But one thing I did want to mention is a really beautiful website that the Maxine Greene Center created. If you go to I think it's just maxinegreen.org, and then there's a place on it called Remembering Maxine. And I think dozens of people have gone onto it to kind of share their memories. And there's some really powerful ones about how her ideas, her lectures that we read in this book, and lectures at many other institutions across New York and across the world, have changed the lives of teachers, actors, a whole range of artists and educators there. So it's something that I would draw to people's attention to sort of engage with, if they're interested in these ideas and want to learn more and kind of see her impact.
Yes, thank you so much, Mike. That's a beautiful way to kind of draw this to a close. And it also, this chat reminded me of the importance of theory and just spending some time, like you said, reading, but then also pausing to think about what is the role of theory in our work, and making time to think about that a little bit deeper and talk about it with colleagues. So this was very helpful. Thank you all so much for participating. So that is going to wrap up our first peer-to-peer reading day, Google Plus Hangout. Thank you for joining us, or if you're watching this later. So like Mike said, there are many places where you can find the work and writings of Maxine Greene. So we invite you to take a closer look, and feel free to add further comments to this event page. The next NAEA Museum Education Division peer-to-peer hangout is on Tuesday, August 19th, also at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we will be talking about this book, Teaching the Museum, Careers in Museum Education. It's edited by Leah Melber. It just came out from the American Alliance of Museums Press, just put it out. It's a great book. So thinking first about theory today, and then thinking about careers in museum education, and sharing different points of view from various practitioners at different levels of their work. So that'll be really interesting. Christine just chatted that she just read that, so I hope that she will join us again. It's a very, it seems like a great, it just came out, but it seems like a really helpful resource already. So please join us for that. And just a quick reminder, there are 2 ways you can participate in NAEA peer-to-peer hangouts. You can participate via video, like the 4 of us did today, and if you're interested, you can message us on our Google Plus page. Our next few hangouts are listed there, so you can find out what the next books are. I'm going to add what the 3rd session, the book, we just decided what that'll be earlier today, so you'll have to go turn it to our page to find out what it is. So a little bit of suspense for you. But thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again next month. Okay, take care.